History is memory. It's what we choose to tell about the present through the lens of the past, the stories we feel we need to remember and to commemorate. And so many stories are willfully forgotten or blatantly erased in the process, particularly by those for whom history is primarily about glory and exceptionalism, what some would call their manifest destiny. This has been determined, they claim, by a higher power, a law of history that is beyond correction or addition or even truth. But what is undeniable to us all is to experience history through the sensation of rhyme. What do I mean by this? The idea, for instance, of the hostile environment as historical rhyme. 8 years ago, in 2012, when David Cameron and Theresa May announced their project to create a hostile environment in order to reduce population numbers in the UK, it was a policy meant to fit a political agenda in order to outflank a rival party, UKIP, on the issue of immigration. A hostile environment. This was never about fairness to people or an accountable system of justice. It became what inevitably happens when a government recklessly outsources the implementation of a discriminatory policy to the wider society, landlords, to banks, to employers, to the NHS. The terrible and terrifying consequences of this arbitrary assault on around 20,000 British citizens of Caribbean heritage is ongoing after nearly a decade. Loss of homes and jobs, withdrawal of health care, detention and curbs on freedom of movement, summary threats of deportation. We seem to have adopted a convenient tabloid shorthand to describe this recent and enduring history. The phrase of countless headlines is the Windrush scandal. But we, British citizens of Caribbean heritage, know that though the form may have changed, hostile environments have been staging posts throughout the 5 centuries of our forced diaspora in the islands that Christopher Columbus misnamed the West Indies. And we've always rebelled, resisting these hostile environments as we continue to do in the current circumstances of 21st century Britain. So let's take a few steps back in time and consider a few of the many hostile environments which rhyme and which echo with the present in the narrative of what the late novelist Andrea Levy called our long song. From the moment our African ancestors were kidnapped, then locked by force into prison ships to be transported into inescapable bondage across the Atlantic Ocean, from Senegal to San Salvador, from Benin to Barbados, he or she became a revolutionary spirit, whether actual or potential. Liberty or death, that was the reflexive and constant refrain of resistance to such a gross and hostile environment. No human being could passively accept mass confinement in the hold of even a heavily armed ship for a journey of 6 weeks or more, especially so as this amounted to violent punishment for no known crime or misdemeanor. The most vivid account of such a hostile environment is given to us by a survivor, one who later became a successful writer, who worked as a tireless campaigner for the abolition of this brutal trafficking in human souls, and who reclaimed his African name once he gained manumission from enslavement. That person was Olaudah Equiano, known to his slavers as Gustavus Vassa. He published his seminal autobiography here in London in 1789. It is still in print 231 years later. He was a mere boy of 11 or 12 when he witnessed the torment of the hostile environment which he describes. Just to flag up a warning, this will be the first of a few accounts from history of hostile environments that I'll be reading to you this evening to illustrate my points. They are stark but true. So if any youngsters are listening or watching, I hope there might be also an adult close by who could help explain anything they might find incomprehensible or not fully able to understand. The full title of Equiano's biography is The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vassa, written by himself, volumes 1 and volume 2. This section is subtitled The Horrors of a Slave Ship. At last, when the ship we were in had got in all her cargo, and they made ready with many fearful noises, and we were all put on the deck, so that we could not see how they managed the vessel, this disappointment was the least of my sorrow. The stench of the hold while we were on the African coast was intolerably loathsome, that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on the deck for the fresh air. But now the whole ship's cargo were confined together, and it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate, added to the number in the ship, was so crowded that each had scarcely room to move or to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs, into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. Necessary tubs are where people defecated, urinated, and vomited like open latrines. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable. Happily, perhaps for myself, I was soon reduced so low here that it was thought necessary to keep me almost always on deck. And from my extreme youth, I was not put in fetters. In this situation, I expected every hour to share the fate of my companions, some of whom were almost daily brought upon the deck at the point of death, which I began to hope would soon put an end to my miseries. Those are the memories of an 11-year-old boy. Equiano recounts in his book, the first of the so-called slave narratives of the 18th and the 19th centuries, of which I think there are about 120 in total, how active resistance, luck, and sharp wits eventually gained him his freedom. He lived in London and in Cambridgeshire at Soham and died in 1799. Today, his statue is one of only 2 black people in the buildings and grounds of the Houses of Parliament. The others of the great West Indies cricketer Leary Constantine, who was the first black member of the House of Lords in 1969. And as Nick said, Equiano's daughter, Joanna Vassa, in the cemetery. The ultimate aim of the Atlantic slave trade was to make profit for European nations from the sale and toil of their African captives on the island penitentiaries which they established in the Caribbean and also on the prison farms of the American continent, North, South, and Central. The brutal trade began with a ruthless routine of deracination. Having been ensnared, then randomly herded into multilingual human cargo under duress, our ancestors were wrenched from their homelands, stripped of their names, and left without a common language. But nonetheless, culture was sustained. It was and remains a dynamic source of resistance. Equiano's story starts in Igbo land on the coast of modern-day eastern Nigeria. Another account from the Portuguese archives describes the moment of abduction at the port of Luanda in modern-day Angola, further south on the Atlantic coast of Africa, and the year is 1618. They have been caught in the hunters' nets and are marching to the coast, tied to each other at the neck as drums of pain resound in the villages. On the African coast, a slave is worth 40 glass necklaces, or a whistle with a chain, or 2 pistols, or a handful of bullets. Muskets and machetes, rum, Chinese silks, or Indian calicos are paid for with human flesh. A monk inspects the column of captives in the main square of the port of Luanda. Each slave receives a pinch of salt on the tongue, a splash of holy water on the head, and a Christian name. Interpreters translate the sermon, "Now you are children of God." The priest instructs them not to think about the lands they are leaving and not to eat dog, rat, or horse meat. They see the ocean for the first time, and the enormous roaring beast terrifies them. They think the whites are taking them to some remote slaughterhouse to eat them and make oil and fat from them. Hippopotamus hide whips drive them onto enormous canoes that cross the breakers. In the ships, they face fore and aft guns with lighted fuses. The fetters and chains keep them from throwing themselves into the sea. Many will die on the voyage. The survivors will be sold in the markets of America and again branded with hot irons. But they will never forget their gods. Oxalá, at once man and woman, will be disguised as Saint Geronimo and Saint Barbara. Obatala will be Jesus Christ, and Oshun, spirit of sensuality and fresh waters, will turn into the virgins of Candelaria, the Conception, Charity, and pleasures will be Saint Anne in Trinidad. Behind Saint George, Saint Anthony, and Saint Michael will lurk the lances of Ogun, god of war, and inside Saint Lazarus, Babalu will sing. The thunders and fires of fearsome Shango will transfigure Saint John the Baptist and Saint Barbara. In Cuba, Elugua will continue having 2 faces, life and death. And in southern Brazil, Exu will have 2 heads, God and the devil, to offer the faithful solace and vengeance. The next account of a hostile environment I'd like to read to you comes from London in the year 1762, and it shows Britain scrambling for its share of the vast profits to be accrued from this blood-soaked trade in human lives. As always, there's a bureaucratic system to help organize and maintain these hostile environments. And the state-sanctioned violence required to gain mercantile advantage was endorsed from the very top of society with the authority, the rubber stamp, and the patronage of the monarchy itself. London, 1672. The Duke of York, brother of the King of England, founded the Company of Royal Adventurers 9 years ago. English planters in the Antilles bought their slaves from Dutch slavers, but the Crown could not permit the purchase of such valuable articles from foreigners. The new enterprise, set up for trade with Africa, had prestigious shareholders. King Charles II, 3 dukes, 8 earls, 7 lords, a countess, and 27 knights. In homage to the Duke of York, the captains burned the letters DY with hot irons onto the breasts of the 3,000 slaves they carried yearly to Barbados and Jamaica. Now the enterprise is to be called the Royal Africa Company. The English king, who holds most of the stock, encourages slave buying in his colonies, where slaves cost 6 times as much as in Africa. Behind the ships, sharks make the trips to the islands, awaiting the bodies that go overboard. Many die because there is not enough water, and the strongest drink what little there is, or because of dysentery and smallpox, and many die from melancholy. They refuse to eat, and there is no way to open their jaws. They lie in rows, crushed against each other, their noses touching the deck above. Their wrists are handcuffed, and fetters wear their ankles raw. When portholes have to be closed in rough seas or rain, the small amount of air rises to fever heat, but with portholes open, the hold stinks of hatred, fermented hatred, fouler than the foulest stench of slaughterhouse, and the floor is always slippery with blood, vomit, and shit. The sailors who sleep on deck listen at night to the endless moans from below, and at dawn to the yells of those who dreamed they were in their own country. Just out of interest, the source of these archives comes from the great late Uruguayan historian Eduardo Galeano, who published a trilogy of books under the title of Memory of Fire, in which he drew extensively from the non-Anglophone archives of Europe. I highly recommend this trilogy. The first edition, which I'm reading from, is called Genesis. The clear ambition of a hostile environment is to unleash a reign of terror against its victims. No presumed offense is trivial enough not to bring down the harshest punishments, like, for instance, not having on demand the right number of documents for an arbitrary number of years. Likewise, for the enslaved ancestors of us British citizens of Caribbean heritage, the ability, say, to read and write, literacy, was judged to be evidence of insurrectionist tendencies which had to be quashed publicly and mercilessly. And this fear-driven penal code was legislated in all the major European languages, which had spread across the territories of the Caribbean and the so-called New World. Apart from English, there was Portuguese, Dutch, German, Danish, Swedish, Russian, and Spanish, in which this witness account, which I'm about to read, was originally written in the year 1624. It comes from Lima, the capital city of modern-day Peru. Lima, 1624. 3 African slaves have paraded the streets of Lima with bound hands and a rope around their necks. The executioners, also black, walked behind. At every few steps, the stroke of the lash, up to a total of 100, and when they fell down, extra lashes as a dividend. The mayor gave the order. The slaves had brought playing cards into the cathedral cemetery, turning it into a gambling den, using gravestones as tables, and the mayor well knew that the lesson would not be lost on the blacks in general, who've become so insolent and so numerous and so addicted to making trouble. Now the three lie in the patio of their master's house. Their backs are raw flesh. They howl as their wounds are washed with urine and rum. Their master curses the mayor, shakes his fist, vows vengeance. One just doesn't play such games with other people's property. The ancestors who resisted the forced rule of the Spanish Empire and fled into the freedom of the woods and the hills became known as the Cimarron. In Jamaica, which used to be a Spanish territory, this was later anglicized to Maroon. In British Guiana, on the north coast of South America, freedom seekers from plantation enslavement were called bush Negroes. And in Brazil, these remote sanctuaries of hard-won escape were known as Palmares. Liberty or death. The barbarity which our ancestors endured in such hostile environments at the whim of the governing authorities from Europe could only be countered with resistance appropriate to a battlefield. That's intelligence, guile, and force born out of patient strength. This is how the legendary 19th century African American statesman Frederick Douglass, who was born into enslavement, tells of his experience with an infamous white man whose job was breaking slaves, especially those deemed insolent or to be making trouble. This professional sadist was named Mr. Covey, and the year of Douglass's account is 1833. If at any one time of my life more than another, I was made to drink the bitterest dregs of slavery, that time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey. We were worked in all weathers. It was never too hot or too cold. It could never rain, blow, hail, or snow too hard for us to work in the field. The longest days were too short for him, and the shortest nights too long for him. I was somewhat unmanageable when I first went there, but a few months of this discipline tamed me. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed, my intellect languished. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed into a brute. On this particular morning, long before daylight, I was called to go and rub and groom and feed the horses. But whilst thus engaged, whilst in the act of throwing down some blades of hay from the loft, Mr. Covey entered the stable with a long rope. Just as I was about halfway out of the loft, he caught hold of my legs and was about tying me. As soon as I found what he was up to, I gave a sudden spring, and as I did so, he holding onto my legs, I was brought sprawling to the stable floor. Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me and could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit, I don't know, I resolved to fight. And suiting my action to the resolution, I seized Covey hard by the throat, and as I did so, I rose. He held on to me and I to him. My resistance was so entirely unexpected that Covey seemed taken all aback. He trembled like a leaf. This gave me assurance, and I held him uneasy, causing the blood to run where I touched him with my fingernails. Mr. Covey soon called out to Hughes for help. Hughes came, and while Covey held me, attempted to tie my right hand. While he was in the act of doing so, I watched my chance, gave him a heavy kick close under the ribs. This kick fairly sickened Hughes, so that he left me in the hands of Mr. Covey. This kick had the effect of not only weakening Hughes, but Covey also. When he saw Hughes bending over with pain, his courage quailed. He asked me if I meant to persist in my resistance. I told him I did, come what might, that he had used me like a brute for 6 months, and I was determined to be used no longer. With that, he strove to drag me to a stick that was lying just outside the stable door. He meant to knock me down. But just as he was leaning over to get the stick, I seized him with both hands by his collar and brought him by a sudden snatch to the ground. We were at it for nearly 2 hours. Covey at length let me go, puffing and blowing at great rate, saying if I had not resisted, he would not have whipped me half as much. The truth was, he had not whipped me at all. I considered him as getting entirely the worst end of the bargain, for he had drawn no blood from me, but I had from him. The whole 6 months afterwards that I spent with Covey on his Negro breaking farm, he never laid the weight of his finger upon me in anger. This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with a determination to be free. The gratification afforded by the triumph was a full compensation for whatever else might follow, even death itself. He only can understand the deep satisfaction which I experienced, who has himself repelled by force the bloody arm of slavery. I felt as I never felt before. It was a glorious resurrection from the tombs of slavery to the heaven of freedom. My long crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place. And I now resolve that, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. It was for a long time a matter of surprise to me why Mr. Covey did not immediately have me taken by the constable to the whipping post, and there regularly whipped for the crime of raising my hand against a white man in defense of myself. And the only explanation I can now think of does not entirely satisfy me, but such as it is, I will give it to you. Mr. Covey enjoyed the most unbounded reputation for being a first-rate overseer and Negro breaker. It was of considerable importance to him. That reputation was at stake. And had he sent me, a boy of about 16 years old, to the public whipping post, his reputation would have been lost. So to save his reputation, he suffered me to go unpunished. Frederick Douglass went on to become a fierce campaigner for the abolitionist movement and for African American liberation. Like Olaudah Equiano, his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, was a widely read contribution to the struggles for abolition. He spent nearly 2 years as a free man in the UK between 1845 and 1847. The final rhyme from history, which I'd like to point to, is the situation soon after the end of the First World War in 1919, when, in a climate of widespread unemployment and economic hardship across the US and in Britain, feelings against Black people by the white majorities began to run high, turning to violence. A vicious campaign of scapegoating led to attacks on established Black communities in ports like Liverpool, in Cardiff, Glasgow, London. Mobs as numerous as 10,000 people rampaged through the streets where Black people resided. Individuals were attacked, some murdered on the grounds of being alien to British shores. Incidents of lynching occurred in American cities like Chicago, Washington, and New York. This season of racist attacks, this particular hostile environment, became known as the Red Summer Riots. The Jamaican-born poet Claude McKay, then living in Harlem, composed a poem of exhortation and resistance in July 1919 as an urgent response to this upsurge of anti-Black violence. McKay moved to London later that year and worked as Britain's first Black newspaper reporter on the Workers' Dreadnought, run by the legendary campaigner for women's right to vote, Sylvia Pankhurst. The poem's title is If We Must Die. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making a mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. Thank you.